It's the last episode of 2021, and, it doesn't matter what we do. I always like to give you a tip, and here's the tip of this week's episode, and that is, people always ask, how long have you been doing this whole, favorite podcast thing? Well, because I name my files, it's SOP, which is short, then the actual episode number, then an underscore, and then the date. And so I just went back to the last episode of every year, and I found out that on episode 388 was the very first time I asked the question, what was your favorite podcast and why? And so I've been doing it every year, mainly to number one. When I get to hear what you're listening to, it gives me a better picture of who you are, and I get to hear your podcast. Plus, I get to hear about other really cool podcasts, and more importantly, I get to understand why. Because the more we understand why people listen to podcasts, the more we can do more of that. And we're doing it again this year in 2021. Hit it, ladies!
The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson.
Podcasting since 2005. I am your award-winning Hall of Fame podcast coach, Dave Jackson. Thanking you so much for tuning in. If you are new to the show, welcome aboard. This is where I help you plan, I help you launch, I help you grow. If you want to, I'll even help you monetize your podcast. My website is schoolofpodcasting.com. You can use the coupon code LISTENER, that's LISTENER, and get 25% off. That's normally 20%, but now through December 31st, I threw in an extra 5% for Christmas. And as I mentioned, this is the What's Your Favorite Podcast episode, where we're going to learn a little bit about what you're listening to, and then more importantly, why you listen to it. I want to thank everybody who chimed in and sent it in. It's always a lot of fun to hear what's going on. Everything that you hear about in this episode, you will see at schoolofpodcasting.com/807. I'm going to say it again, schoolofpodcasting.com/807. And the first person that always sends in their answer first, every single year, I think, since I've done this going back to 2013, is the one, the only, Steve Stewart.
Hey, SOP family, it's Steve Stewart from stevestewart.me, podcast editor for personal finance podcasts, with my favorite podcast of 2021, which is the Stacking Benjamin Show. The same as last year, and the same as last before that, and it's been the same since Dave started doing this. And I've been a fan of the Stacking Benjamin Show since the beginning. I was a fan of theirs before the show started. So right off the bat, my favorite podcast, the Stacking Benjamin Show, which you can find at stackingbenjamins.com. Why is it my favorite? Well, you can listen to any of the previous years of my favorite podcast episodes that Dave put out. Dave can link it up in the show notes and listen to my 5-minute explanation for why I love the show so much. But I will give you some stats. And we love stats. As podcasters, we love stats. So here's what I can tell you. There's been at least 1,100 episodes of the Stacking Benjamin Show. I really think it's more than 1,200. My numbers might be off, but I can tell you with a fact that by the time you're hearing this, I will laid my hands on 800 of those episodes. I've been an editor for them since 2016 and have edited about 800 of those episodes. Crazy. And loving every minute of it. Well, most minutes of it. Okay. There's quite a few minutes that I enjoy, but if you listen to the show, you'll understand why. Go listen to the Stacking Benjamin Show with Joe Saul-Sehy and OG, his co-host, at stackingbenjamins.com. Thanks, SOP family. Happy holidays.
Thank you, Steve. Always good to hear from you. I interviewed Steve and Mark Deal on episode 752 about the Podcast Editor Academy. If you're thinking of trying to earn some income as an editor, definitely check out that episode. And again, links out in the show notes, schoolofpodcasting.com/807.
This is York from Poetic Earthlings, original sci-fi stories that you can't get out of your head. My favorite show this year is the Matt Walsh Show. You may have heard of him. He's controversial. What I like about him is that he makes you think. He makes you groan at times. He also makes you laugh. He also built up a cult following. He's the only podcaster that I know that has his face on a t-shirt. And this face is attached to a baby's body. And people buy this. They show it all around town. Also, Matt is a little bit of a troll as well. He tries to expose certain things in the media, in politics. You may not like his show at all, but the good thing about him is that he doesn't care. I mean, he does care about his audience, but he doesn't necessarily care if you like his show. As podcasters, there's a lot of things that we can learn from listening to his show. Even if you're not into his politics or social views, but his style, the way that he's able to connect with his audience, there's a lot to appreciate and to learn from it. You could check out his show on YouTube. He does have both a podcast and a YouTube channel. Just type in The Matt Walsh Show. And check out my show, Poetic Earthlings. If you want to escape from this world and allow me to take you somewhere else, then go to my website, poeticearthlings.com. New season starts early 2022. You could also follow up with all of the other seasons as well. Thank you, Dave. Take care.
Thank you, York. A lot of insights in there. Guy doesn't care. He's just going to do his show. He's got some merch, so those that really like his show can support him that way. And he's making you think. He's making you groan. Love it. Thanks for sending that in.
Hey, Dave. Chris Lewis from the Dads with Daughters podcast. Excited to be able to talk to you again this year with my favorite podcast of the year. And really, this podcast is one that I've been listening to since the very beginning. And it's the Real Brian Show. If you've never listened to the Real Brian Show, one of the things that I love about it is it's real. It's a show that has a ton of high energy. It's really fun and bringing in kind of an entertainment, but really positivity. And for me, that's one of the things that I love most about the show. Brian and the other guests on the show, they geek out. They have a ton of fun with the content that they're sharing, which is something that I really enjoy. But in the end, they always make sure that the message is positive. And in a world that we're in that is not always positive, it is really nice to be able to have something like that I can rely on every week on Fridays to be able to wake up to. I've had the opportunity to meet Brian in person. I've been able to keep in touch with him. And not only is his show positive, but to be honest, he's the same person that he is in person as he is that you listen to every week. So for me, The Real Brian Show is my pick of the year. The Real Brian Show is my pick of the year. It can be found at realbrianshow.com. And again, my show is the Dads with Daughters podcast. It's a part of a 501c3 called Fathering Together, which can be found at fatheringtogether.org.
Thank you so much, Chris. I actually interviewed Brian back on episode 449 when he was doing Profit Cast, but a couple great things to learn there. Number one, Brian is positive. And I don't know about you guys, but when I turn on the news, it kind of sounds like this. We're all going to die. And I don't know. It's just kind of nice to have something that's not that. And he's consistent, but keep in mind, when we talk about consistency, it's great that Brian's every Friday. It's even better that every Friday he brings good content. It's not enough to just be consistent. It's consistently good. Think about this. Since we're doing this here around the holidays, would you rather have, let's say you order something fragile from Amazon and you get it shipped overnight, but it's broken. And then you try again and you say, hey, ship it in 3 days. And it arrives not really as soon as you wanted, but it's not broken. I would much rather have an episode that is good, that is late, than one that's on time and, well, meh.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, Glenn.
This is Glenn Gabriel from the Coaching Kids Curling podcast. My favorite podcast of 2021 is The Dave Chang Show on the Ringer Podcast Network. Why is it my favorite podcast? I narrowed it down to 3 reasons. The first reason is that representation matters. Dave is Korean American, and his co-hosts are also Asian American. I grew up in Canada as the son of Filipino immigrants, and it was rare to hear or see people like me in the media. Today, I'm lucky enough to have podcasts like Dave's, where the hosts can be free to express their culture and heritage, and to share stories of growing up Asian in North America. I can't underestimate how important that is to me. The second reason I like the podcast? Food. Food is the primary subject of the show, whether it's eating it, making it, buying or selling it. Dave is an accomplished chef and owner of the Momofuku restaurant group, so he has the experience and the knowledge. But he always approaches food with a sense of humor. The third reason I like the podcast? Well, sometimes it makes me yell at the hosts. Like the last time it happened, they were arguing if lumpia, Filipino spring rolls, could be considered a side dish, or were they just an appetizer? The answer? Oh yeah, they could be a side dish. Now, any podcast that can make me yell at it while it's playing is probably doing something right. So those are my 3 reasons why The Dave Chang Show is my favorite podcast of 2021. My name is Glenn Gabriel, and I'm the host and producer of the Coaching Kids Curling podcast. My mission is to provide advice, resources, and inspiration to youth curling coaches and program organizers. Our website is coachingkidscurling.com. Dave, thank you for all your work. I've been a loyal listener of your shows, The School of Podcasting and Ask the Podcast Coach, since I started my own podcast in 2020. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you and to every podcast producer out there.
Hey, Glenn, thank you so much. I just talked about this on episode 806. Go to schoolofpodcasting.com/806. And I said, look, I didn't have Glenn's issue. When I grew up, all the people on the screens looked like me. I'm a middle-aged white dude. And so I said, if you are a person of color, I'm here to tell you, if you're like, I'd start a podcast, but there are already a bunch of podcasts about blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but they're not from your perspective. And people want to identify with people. And sometimes it's like, hey, the only people that know what it's like to grow up Asian in whatever country you're in are other people that are Asian growing up in the country where you're in. So people of color, jump in. The water is fine. Podcasting is waiting for you. And also, I've learned a new fun phrase, and that is, of course, Momofuku. It sounds like something, maybe if you drop something on your foot, like, Momofuku! Because it's, anyway, continuing on. Also, Glenn said he made him laugh. Laughter is always huge.
Hi, this is Kim Newlove from the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. My favorite podcast in 2021 has been The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson. The website is schoolofpodcasting.com. Why do I love it? The biggest reason is that I learn a lot from Dave. I also learn from his guests and all of you who respond each month to the question of the month. I have a podcast and I love to learn, but I don't necessarily keep up with what's going on in the world of podcasting. Dave shares content that I wouldn't otherwise know about and should probably be aware of. 2 examples are episodes 792 and 779. Episode 792 talked about what happens to your podcast when you die, something I definitely had never thought about. And episode 779 revealed a legitimate reason to get reviews on Apple Podcasts. I also like that the School of Podcasting comes out every Monday. It helps me look forward to Mondays. Thanks, Dave. A little bit about me and my podcast. Again, my name is Kim Newlove, and I am the host of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. I am a pharmacist by training, but I made a career transition to voice actor and podcast host. Among other things, I narrate audiobooks for women pharmacist authors, and I provide medical narration to clients in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. I was inspired by my nonverbal teenaged son with autism to leverage my identity as a pharmacist and my speaking voice, and I launched my voiceover business, The Pharmacist's Voice, in 2017. With the help of Dave Jackson and the School of Podcasting, I launched the Pharmacist's Voice podcast in 2019. I have a business with a podcast. For the most part, I alternate solo shows and interview shows. My solo shows are about some aspect of being a pharmacist, a voice actor, a pharmacist podcaster, or my career transition from pharmacist to voice actor and podcast host. My interview shows feature a variety of people who use their voices to advocate for something, educate in some way, or entertain so that my listeners can feel inspired to use their voices too. You can find my podcast at thepharmacistvoice.com. Dave, thank you for everything you do for podcasters. I love your show. And thank you for including my response in the December 2021 Question of the Month. Happy podcasting, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kim. I'm blushing, and yes, the check is in the mail. If you want to see a great example, sometimes when you get into kind of a monetization area, like for the longest time, the School of Podcasting was a podcast that had a business. And I think it was last year when I finally switched my website, and it is now a business that has a podcast. And Kim's website, The Pharmacist's Voice, is a great example of someone who has a business that also has a podcast.
Hi, Dave. This is Louis Goodman of the Love Thy Lawyer podcast, where we interview attorneys, judges, and those involved with the legal profession about their personal and professional lives. You can find us at lovethylawyer.com and, of course, wherever you listen. My favorite podcast this year is a well-produced 8-part series from the Los Angeles Times called The Trials of Frank Carson. Frank Carson, now deceased, was an aggressive criminal defense true believer who found himself, along with 2 California Highway Patrol officers, 2 local business people, his wife and stepdaughter, charged with murder. This is a fascinating, true, and realistic look inside the criminal justice system. Thank you, Dave, for once again giving me the opportunity to shamelessly promote the Love Thy Lawyer podcast. And let me say this, Dave, that I personally guarantee that every listener to this podcast, the School of Podcasting podcast, whether an attorney, a podcaster, or not, will be fascinated, entertained, and educated by episode number 94 of the Love Thy Lawyer podcast, which will drop on December 29th, 2021. Also, listen to the trials of Frank Carson. You will not be disappointed.
Thank you, Louis. That episode that he's talking about, episode 94, features, well, some guy named Dave Jackson on it. Again, links to everything out at schoolofpodcasting.com/807.
Good morning, Dave. This is Scott Johnson, and my favorite podcast for 2021 is a show called How Sound from PRX. And the reason I chose that show is because of how it has affected the production of my own show. My podcast is an interview show. Every episode is an interview. And when I started doing it about 3.5 years ago, I figured, okay, the format for this podcast is pretty straightforward, just 2 people having a conversation. Yeah, I'll have some intro and outro music, but that's the same for each episode, so it's not complicated. And that's how it went for a while, a couple of years anyway. And fortunately, the stories that my guests were bringing were intriguing and crazy enough to carry the show and grow a decent-sized audience. But then as I listened to other podcasts, like some of the NPR shows like This American Life and some others, I heard them doing things that I thought maybe I could be doing, like bringing in some other people to the conversation in addition to the guest, to get a different perspective inside the same story, or maybe adding a news clip if the story involves something that made the news. And I also noticed that some of the shows don't use the same intro background music for each episode. They choose the music to fit the mood of the story. So I've been learning to figure out how to take all of these individual elements and assemble them together to make a coherent story. And that's what the How Sound podcast is about. The description they have in Apple Podcasts is just one sentence. It says, "The backstory to great radio storytelling," hosted by Rob Rosenthal for Transom and PRX. For a lot of their episodes, they find some other podcast that has a beautifully orchestrated story, and they'll talk to the host or the producer and get the behind-the-scenes details on how it all came together. Dave, you've used the phrase, "how the sausage was made," And this show is kind of like a guided tour through the sausage factory. I get to hear the actual thought process of people who have a ton of experience and creativity in how they put together a particular episode, and I just find it to be really enlightening. Usually I'm listening when I'm out riding my bike in the morning, and there have been a few times when I hear something that sounds like a thing that I can incorporate into my own show, and I have to immediately stop riding and send myself an email so I don't forget. So the show is called How Sound. That's like the word how and the word sound, but it's all one word. And I recommend it for anyone who has a podcast that involves telling a story. My show is called What Was That Like? And each episode is a conversation with a regular person who's been through some type of extremely unusual situation, such as being shot in a mass shooting, surviving a plane crash, getting bitten by a rattlesnake, or getting a deal on Shark Tank. Those are a few of the past episodes. The guest comes on the show and tells the story of what happened firsthand. It's on all the apps or at whatwasthatlike.com.
Whatwasthatlike.com, definitely one of my favorite podcasts. And if you listen to that clip, what Scott is really saying is, number one, that show is helping him better his show. And number two, it got him to think. It got him to go, different music to set the mood.
Well, happy holidays, Dave. Neil Scott here, producer and host of Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast, America's Voice for Recovery, which can be found at recoverycoasttocoast.org and on all the podcast platforms. I listen to many podcasts, and my favorites fluctuate based on my mood, circumstances, and my available time. Then, of course, there are podcast categories. Shows that I miss on TV that are now available as a podcast. Podcasts that deal with becoming a better podcaster, which are essential listening, with the School of Podcasting right at the top of that list, followed closely by Ask the Podcast Coach and The Feed. They are must-listen-to podcasts. But as for the question at hand, what is my favorite podcast and why? Well, my answer has changed several times since you posed the question earlier in the month. But I have settled on one, at least for today. Well, tomorrow could be different. But here and now, it is the Bob Lefsetz podcast. Allow me to share my reasons. First of all, Bob has put out a regular newsletter for many years, mainly about the entertainment industry and America at large. He goes deep into the newsletter. And frankly, it, for me, got to be just a long wall of words, and words that I often didn't have the time to fully read. So about a year ago, I discovered that he had a podcast. I was pretty stunned at his guest list, which included Jeff Garlin, Grace Slick, Titus Welliver, who plays Bosch on television, Jimmy Buffett, Joe Bonamassa, Jimmy Kimmel, Judy Collins, Paul Anka, even Donny Osmond and Pat Boone, both of which I could have cared less about, but was stunned by the depth of the interview that Bob Lefsetz did with these two. He has a way of asking questions that at first seemed intrusive and really over-the-top personal. Questions like, what did you do with all of your money? And your marriage broke up. Tell me what happened. Was it your fault or her fault? Or his fault or her fault? I was fascinated by the guests' honest answers. It was clear that Bob Lefsetz had gained their trust. Very important. He also is an extremely attentive listener. He doesn't have a set list of questions, but rather the questions originate from what the guest is saying. And when there's an uncomfortable pause, he lets it go. He goes with it. And that is usually followed by more personal, pertinent information. In addition, he keeps the interviewee on point. If a guest starts to veer off track, he will say, no, wait a minute, stop right there. Let's go back to such and such. The content is entertaining, at times riveting, informative, and it flows like a gentle river. It's clearly about the guest, not about the interviewer, something I believe we should all strive for. Now, my listening time is limited. I'm a daily runner. Actually, I haven't missed a day of running in over 17 years. and every single day I run with a podcast. I'm also in my car quite a bit. Again, the podcast is my passenger. The best way for me to do a better podcast is to listen and learn from podcasts and podcasters that entertain, that inform, captivate. I always want my next podcast to be a little better than my last one. So again, my current favorite, at least as of today, is the Bob Lefsetz podcast. And that's spelled Lefsetz. And thanks, Dave, for challenging me to focus on what and why in my listening routine. And again, my name is Neil Scott, and the podcast is recoverycoasttocoast.org, featuring real people and real stories of everyday recovery from addiction. The bright side of addiction is recovery. Happy holidays, and may the new year be filled with hope, happiness, and good health.
Neil is a member of the School of Podcasting. So when I talk about one of the benefits of being a member of the School of Podcasting is we have a Facebook group filled with awesome podcast minds, and he's one of those. And Neil brought up something that I always say, if you're doing interviews, you want to ask the questions that your audience would ask if they were behind the microphone. And it sounds like Mr. Lefsetz is doing it. I remember him. That's an old music guy. So back when my very first podcast 16 years ago was for musicians. So it's nice to hear that that guy finally took that really long newsletter that sometimes people look at and go, I'm not reading that, but they'll listen to it in the car when they're on their way to work. So if you're a blogger, you've already got great content. Just do it into a microphone. I can help with that.
Hey, Dave, it's Matt Rafferty. So my favorite podcast of 2021 was one called The Grand Scheme, Snatching Sinatra. It's hosted by none other than John Stamos, and he interviews a guy by the name of Barry Keenan, who actually kidnapped Frank Sinatra's son back in the 1960s. It's a fascinating story with all kinds of twists and turns, and I highly recommend it. It's 10 episodes long, and it's very well done. So if you're thinking about writing a book in 2022, check out my podcast. It's called The Author Inside You. You can find it at theauthorinside.you.com. We interview authors about writing, publishing, and promoting their books. Thanks, Dave, and Happy New Year.
Boy, speaking of awesome minds that are at the School of Podcasting, Matt is one of them. Matt actually helped me get on TV here in Ohio. Kim Newlove is another member. I'm probably missing some folks. But one of those people, we heard Steve Stewart earlier talk about Stacking Benjamins, and this is Joe, the host of Stacking Benjamins.
Hey, Dave, and everyone in our little School of Podcasting family. Joe Salsihai from the Stacking Benjamins podcast. You know, I have a different favorite podcast every time I've given one of these, and it's because of the situation that we're in. This year, my favorite podcast was a podcast called Xbox On, which is a podcast about the Xbox, and it's one guy, a guy named Jesse DeRosa, who makes it. And I'll tell you why this was my favorite podcast this year. I have, as do you, Dave, a lot of rules about podcasting. And I feel like the first thing that you do when you podcast is you learn how to become a master to steal from Michael Gerber and his fantastic book, The E-Myth. You learn how to make the cake first. You become a master at making the cake. And there's a specific way to do it. And then you're really a master when you break that mold. In other words, you don't just say, well, this is personal and I do it however I want. No, you learn how to do it the right way, and you do it the right way, and then you break the mold. And this is a gentleman who does everything that I completely dislike in a podcast. He immediately talks about what's going on with his listeners, and he is mixing it up with their letters at the beginning. I generally think community stuff belongs in the back of your podcast, just in case it doesn't resonate with everyone. And a lot of times the things that he talks about are things that have nothing to do with Xbox, which is the point of the show. Yet he's so entertaining, and he's so a member of his community, and he gets along with them. I get this nice, warm fuzzy every time I listen to the show, because he makes me feel like I'm a part of this community, and the jokes that he tells and the laughing that goes on. He breaks one of the first rules that I firmly believe and does it incredibly well. Then he has a segment where he talks about fast food and he still hasn't talked about the Xbox. In fact, he will sometimes go an hour before he gets to the quote point of his show. And it doesn't matter. It might matter if you're just there for hard facts. And what you and I know, my friend, is that many of us are there for community. We want to be part of a community. I listen to the School of Podcasting because of the fact that I enjoy hearing the other voices on the show. I enjoy the community. I enjoy just, kind of hanging out on Mondays here, on Monday mornings. And it's the same way with Xbox On. And so his love of all things community and getting that he's nowhere without his community, I think is huge. One thing that we've all seen this past year are a bunch of people getting into podcasting. And you said this on a recent episode again, which is there's so many people getting into it saying, how do I monetize? What do I do? This is a guy who is just in love with hanging out with the people that love the same thing that he loves, the Xbox. And it is such a fun show. It's called Xbox On, breaks all the rules and yet is amazing. And it's funny. I played it for my son who doesn't play Xbox. And my son and I laughed our way through an episode and he said he still listens to Xbox On just because he likes Jesse DeRosa. So that's my favorite of 2021, Xbox On.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I've said it before, your show is not a statue. It's a recipe. And you can learn how to make that cake and then take those recipe ingredients and put them in any way you want because it's your show. But I love what Joe said. He said he loved the way the show made him feel. He felt part of a community. And again, I reach out and I say, there are people that want to connect with other people because we're all separated. Even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, we still kind of want to connect with people. That's a human nature kind of thing. Going back to the real Brian, I remember once I was making a desk, that whole insert slot A into tab B. And you're like, wait, I was supposed to have 5 screws. Why do I only have 2? Wait, is this the big one? You've been there, right? And you're ready to just punch something. And I turned on podcasting. The Real Brian show came on and instantly I was not alone. I was in the room with a friend. I took a deep breath and everything was cool. So jump into podcasting if you're ready to go and help other people feel not so alone. And if you're feeling alone, you won't feel alone either. And Joe, I'm thinking about you, buddy. Next time, Bob Evans is on me.
Hi. This is Mark Vinette from the History of North America podcast, where I explore the wonderful and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography at markvinette.com. My favorite podcast is C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus with host and C-SPAN founder Brian Lamb, who is my favorite interviewer. He asks short, pithy questions with the aim of learning as much as possible and always makes the interview about the guest and not himself, unlike other celebrity network personalities who often seem to talk more about themselves than their guests or topics.
Thank you, Mark. You made me go out and look up the definition of the word pithy. I've never heard of that word. I thought, does Mark have a lisp? That would be kind of different. And it turns out pithy, P-I-T-H-Y, is concise, forceful, and expressive. So pithy questions, now I get it. Never heard of that word before.
Hello, Dave. It's Shane Whaley here from spybrary.com. My favorite show of 2021, always a tough decision this because I have so many favorites in my Overcast app. But I would have to say it's a show called That Record Got Me High, and their website is thatrecordgotmehigh.com. What I like about it is they will take an album and dissect it. They'll bring on really good guests, people who know a lot about the artist or that particular album. And it's amazing how many things I've learned about some of my favorite albums from listening to That Record Got Me High. And also sometimes I will pick one out of an album. For instance, I think one of their recent ones was Miles Davis, On the Corner, and not one I'm familiar with. So I'll often give that a go. Now, I know you've talked about music in podcasts. So should you listen to this one, David, I think you might be grimacing because they do use music, which they probably shouldn't. But you know what? That's down to them. I always worry that maybe one day their podcast will be gone, but they've been getting away with it for quite some time. Occasionally their audio is a bit scratchy when they bring a guest on, but for me, the content's good. So there was a particular album I really enjoy, and the guest audio was pretty ropey, but I still persevered with it because the content was good. The guy really knew his stuff, but I really wanted to email him and say, hey, you need to get on Dave's School of Podcasting editing course, and you can make this audio so much better. So that record got me high.com. David, thank you for everything you do. It's been a pleasure to support your work this year. It was great to finally get to meet you in person, and hopefully we will do the same in 2022.
Hope so. And here we go. We see again that if you have really good content, and one of the things that Shane said is this show helps him discover new music. And if it's really good music, that's valuable. And because it's valuable, Shane will put up with basically fairly crappy audio, it sounds like, the quality of it. And you can get away with that. But if you do not deliver value and your audio quality is caca-a-poo-poo, people will tune out. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go spend $4,000 on equipment. You can get a Samson Q2U and be in the game under $100. But you can't have that Samson Q2U be 5 feet away from you in another room with somebody mowing the lawn in your living room, that kind of stuff. That's just not going to work.
Greetings, Dave, from Frosty, Michigan. This is Joe Munum, off and on podcaster since 2005 and currently between shows. Saying that I have a favorite podcast sounds suspiciously like having a favorite child, and I'm not going to do that. So I'll tell you about my favorite new podcast. And that would be the Warrior Next Door podcast with hosts Tony Lupo and Ryan Fairfield. The show involves introducing people to the actual warriors next door from World War II. Tony and Ryan volunteered in the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress, and they've repurposed those interviews into this podcast. It's a fascinating look into the greatest generation. And while sometimes the audio on the interviews isn't great, they make sure to zoom out and give everything that the veterans are saying historical context. You'll learn all about the fan clubs between the B-17 and the B-24 and rationing back home during the war. As you've suggested, Dave, on the School of Podcasting, appearing on somebody else's show has benefit. So I learned of the Warrior Next Door podcast by listening to the World War II podcast by Ray Harris. So right you are. It's an excellent way to promote your show. I would encourage all of your listeners with an interest in history to listen to the Warrior Next Door podcast. Thanks, Dave, and have a great new year.
Thank you. And again, here we hear where when you have great content that you can't get in any place else, you'll kind of put up with some kind of okay quality for your audio. The School of Podcasting is where you can learn how to podcast and never worry about sounding stupid, buying equipment that you'll never need, and more importantly, never being alone. I have step-by-step tutorials that'll walk you through flushing out your idea, launching it into Apple and Google and Spotify and all that, and making sure you sound like $1 million without spending $1 million. You can work with me in a number of ways. Go out to schoolofpodcasting.com/work with me. You want one-on-one consulting? We can do that. Want a 3-month mentorship? We can do that. Just want to join the School of Podcasting? You can definitely do that. Go out to schoolofpodcasting.com/work with me. Oh, if you could see my face, there is a giant smile on it. That music that you just heard was the kind of theme music to my very first podcast, and I have not heard that in a very long time. We got a couple more responses coming up. Then I'm going to share you my favorite podcast and, of course, January's question of the month. We're going to pass it over to Brian.
Hey, Dave Jackson. What I've been listening to, and one podcast I've just been absolutely digging, is the Eliven Free podcast. It is hosted by a guy named Bob Gardner, and you can find him over at thefreedomspecialist.com. Now, what is it that I like about this particular show? And I have to say that it is just his view and his philosophy on what our weird hangups are. His latest one is How to Never Work Again. And it actually breaks down why we use the word work incorrectly. And he talks it through and explains how we are actually hobbling ourselves and causing ourselves so much stress because we are working instead of what it is that we're doing. We're taking orders or talking to clients or having a meeting or whatever, instead of actually talking about specifically what it is we're doing, he's actually going through and explaining that word work is what's actually causing a lot of people a lot of the stress and why we're actually procrastinating. That's what I like about it. I love how he breaks things down. He's done some that just really pushed me against some comfort thoughts that I had. And at the end of it gone, oh, well, okay, yeah, I could see where he's driving at. This is actually not a bad thing. He talked about the history of the devil and then flipped it around and talked about the history of God, and it made it a great thing. Bob does a wonderful job of explaining and helping to understand his philosophy in life and how to breathe free and be free and live life on your terms, which is what my podcast and my show is all about. My show is The Relaxed Male, as in dude, and you can find that over at relaxedmale.com. And so, David, I appreciate it tremendously for everything you're doing. Again, this is Brian Goodwin. You take care. We'll talk to you then.
There you go, Brian. Again, making you think. Check out Brian over at relaxedmale.com.
Hello, Dave Jackson and the School of Podcasting audience. This is Anthony Arno, host of the Route 66 podcast, where we talk with people living and working along Route 66, America's Main Street. We're at Route66podcast.com. Dave, you must be rubbing off on me because I started my second podcast in 2021, the STEM Class Podcast, where I talk with fellow teachers, authors, and STEM pioneers. My most recent episode features the 1990s Biosphere 2 project, where 8 humans locked themselves into a 3-acre closed environment for 2 full years. Was it an experiment or a $200 million failed space colony? You could hear that show at thestemclass.com. Dave, my favorite podcast and why? I'm going to say The Space Shot, which is a podcast featuring space history from the early days of Mercury, Gemini, and the Apollo program to the Space Shuttle program. With over 400 episodes out there, I've been binge listening and find myself daydreaming about where I was when the actual events occurred. In fact, I was just listening the other day to the Skylab episode, and I remember working as a lifeguard that summer at a local scout camp, and we put a bullseye target in the middle of the lake, hoping that Skylab would land right there at our Boy Scout camp. Well, it didn't. It landed somewhere in the Indian Ocean on July 11, 1979. Dave, I want you to know how much I enjoy listening to both Ask the Podcast Coach and the School of Podcasting, and they've become part of my weekly routine. Thank you for all that you do, and I'm wishing you and your listeners a wonderful 2022. Take care. P.S. The Space Shot is at thespaceshot.fireside.fm.
Thank you so much. And again, I'll have links to all this out at schoolofpodcasting.com/807. And my favorite podcast is new. It's brand new from a guy that's been around forever. He's been basically measuring streaming services for 25 years. He's actually done work for syndicated programs such as The Howard Stern Show and Elvis Duran. And he is currently the senior vice president of Edison Research. And if you haven't guessed already, I'm talking about Tom Webster. The podcast is called I Hear Things. And I'm so happy because I Hear Things started off as a newsletter. And again, I say to all bloggers, I can't read your blog in the car, but I sure can listen to it if you put it out as a podcast. And I'm not sure how old Tom is. For all I know, I might be older than Tom, but Tom has gray hair like me. He wears glasses like me, and he has phenomenal pipes. His whole tone and everything. And the other thing is, Tom's kind of snarky. In fact, Tom used to have a podcast, I'm not making this up, called Tom Reads His Spam. And so Tom A has this phenomenal view of the podcasting space. Of course, I want to hear what Tom has to say, but the main thing Tom does is he makes me think, and I go, ooh, I did not know that because, again, he's going to bring knowledge that I didn't think of because he's working in a whole different bubble than I am. So he brings me knowledge that I can't get anyplace else. He does it in a fun, entertaining, slightly snarky way. He's around my age-ish and consequently will drop something that you will only get if you're over 40-ish kind of thing. And that's why this year, and I had to think about this a lot because I really like What Was That Like? I'm still a huge fan of the No Agenda show, but I thought about that. I'm like, what triggers me that when I see, there's a new episode, bam, I'm hitting play. And the other thing Tom does really well is he names his episodes really good. Let me give you a couple. Racing and Pacing and Plotting the Course. Why would people listen to podcasts on YouTube? The Last Best Frontier for Podcasting. Music was better in my day. Now get off my yard. the crux of the kerfuffle. Come on. Try to work the word kerfuffle into your vocabulary today. That's a great word right there. Look for the Flowers. Normal, but not back to normal. Looking into the Matrix, digital audio edition, podcasting for connection, all sorts of great things. You can find it at tomwebster.media. And I will give you the January question of the month in just a second. But as we listen to this, what did we hear? We heard people like shows because they make them laugh. I didn't hear anybody say anything about crying, but I know on the show What Was That Like by Scott, he makes his guests cry all the time, and that's always interesting to hear. So laugh, cry, think. I just said think for Tom. Laugh, cry, think, groan. We heard a lot of groaning in this episode. People that are like, screaming at their device as they're listening to it. Laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, right? I'm getting information from Tom and his vast knowledge. I know a lot of people listen to the New Media Show with Rob Greenlee and Todd Cochran because of that. Scott listens to House Sound because he's getting educated and then entertaining, right? Joe Salsi High, on one hand, is entertaining Steve Stewart because Stacking Benjamins is definitely not like your dad's financial show. If you've never checked out Stacking Benjamins, definitely entertaining. And who was the other one that was it? Joe was mentioning the guy from Stacking Benjamins said that the Xbox On show, like the guy breaks all the rules, but doggone it, is he entertaining. So I love this episode. It's always fun to listen to and also gives me an idea of what you are up to and what you're listening to. The question of the month for January 2022. 2022 is here already. Is this. Here's the one I want to look at. Here's the topic. We all know we want people to follow/subscribe because that means the next time an episode comes out, it's going to go to their device. And we can all argue, does that mean they really listen? Yeah. Okay, yeah, another day, shall we? But we want people to follow and subscribe. So here is what I want you to talk about. I'm kind of like, there's a voice in my head that goes, Dave, this is too vague a question. You shouldn't do this. It's very vague, but that means we're going to get a wide variety of stuff because I want to understand what makes people subscribe. And I'm going to keep saying subscribe because I'm old. I should be saying follow, but I'm going to say subscribe. So forgive me, but let's pretend you're going to Apple Podcasts. Even if you're not, we'll just use Apple Podcast as an example. When you go to Apple Podcasts and you're looking for a podcast, and I realize that 70% of you don't go to Apple Podcasts or Google or Spotify. 70% of people find podcasts through a friend. So let's talk about the other 30%. You're looking for a podcast and you're now in that app and you search for your topic. Okay. That's where we're starting at. You've searched for your topic and I want you to talk about what happens from there. What is it? The artwork that catches the eye? Is it the title that catches the eye? Is it the episode titles that catch your eye? And then do you instantly subscribe or do you have to listen to a few episodes before you subscribe/follow? Or do you never subscribe and just cherry pick? So I realize I just gave you like 13 different questions. I want you to go to schoolofpodcasting.com/question. That is really the place, as much as I appreciate you going to my contact page, for me to keep this better organized, I really deeply appreciate it if you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/question and answer this and just talk about what goes through your head when that ends up with you following or subscribing to a show. Because in the end, as podcasters, that's kind of what we really want people to do. So schoolofpodcasting.com/question. And I need this by, he said, pulling up his calendar, Friday, the 28th of January, 2022, as this will be coming out on Monday, the 31st, as the last episode of January. As we get ready to head out the door, I want to give a shout out to Zach and Craig. They are the two latest people to join the School of Podcasting. You should be like Zach and Craig because you can join worry-free. If for some reason you start this anytime within that first 30 days and you're like, Dave, this isn't for me, I will give you your money back. Join worry-free. Use the coupon code LISTENER when you sign up at schoolofpodcasting.com/start. In the future, I'm going to be reviewing some products that you might be able to use to clean up your guest audio as you're doing the interview. It's pretty cool. I saw a demo of it and I was like, all right, I need to kick the tires on this. On an update on the Tascam thing that we've been doing, if you're new to the show, Tascam sent me a unit of the Miscast 4. It didn't work. Sweetwater gave me a brand new one, and now it turns out that Tascam gave me a new one. So I'm going to send the one back to Sweetwater, and I will continue to experiment with this, and eventually I'm going to come up with a video for the Rodecaster versus the Tascam. I always say, for me, it's kind of like saying, which one's the better singer, Demi Lovato or Christina Aguilera? It's the same thing. One's blonde and one's brunette, but pretty much you've got a short female singer that can have a voice that will, like, you know, break the windows. Very powerful voice speakers. Both those people, I love them. So subscribe or follow at schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe and never miss an episode. Thanks so much for a great 2021. You've helped keep my sanity. I deeply appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your holiday season. And until next week, take care. God bless. Class is dismissed. Podcasting since 2005. Why can't I hear myself at all? I can't hear myself, but I'm too loud, yeah. Oh, pegging the meter, yeah. Oh, peg the meter, yeah. Oh, okay, there we go. That's better. It's much better. And the podcast is called, it's called I Cough a Lot. I felt that coming, too. I was like, I should probably drink here, but I didn't. And, well, we saw what happened. Heard a lot of groaning in this episode. People like, yeah, I kind of like to yell at the car, at the radio, or the whatever I'm listening on. Crap. Why, brain? I need my brain to work right now. Give me words. I need words, please. I would like words to come at the right moment, if that's okay. Right.
This is your friendly boost reminder. It's time to boost.
Not sure what that means? Check out fountain.fm and support Value for Value.